You've saved $1.5 million. You plan to withdraw 4.7%, about $70,500 a year, adjusted for inflation every year, exactly the way most retirement calculators recommend. It's a solid number. It's what the math says you can afford. I ran this plan through actual historical market data, starting in the worst possible year for a retiree, 1973. The portfolio runs out of money in year 24. Not because you spent too much. Not because you made bad decisions. Because of a trap called sequence of returns risk, and most retirement plans ignore it completely. The standard fix you'll hear is, just skip the inflation adjustment in bad years. That sounds reasonable. But here's the problem. You don't know which years are bad until they're already over. So that advice requires perfect hindsight you don't have. What I'm going to show you today is an automatic rule, one that doesn't require a crystal ball, that could have kept that same $1.5 million plan alive through the full 30 years. Let's start with exactly why it fails in the first place, and how two retirees with identical average returns can end up $400,000 apart. Meet Ken. He's 65, just retired with $1.5 million saved. His portfolio is 60% stocks, 40% bonds, the classic allocation. He plans to withdraw $70,500 a year, adjusted for inflation every year, starting in January 1973. By year 24, his balance hits zero. That's the scenario we're testing today. Not hypothetical, not a projection. Actual historical numbers, actual market returns from 1973 through 1997. Here's what happened. In 1973, the S&P 500 fell 14.7%. In 1974, it fell another 26.5%. So Ken is taking $70,500 out of a portfolio that just lost close to a third of its value in 2 years. The money he withdraws can't compound back. It's gone, and when the big bull market of the 1980s finally arrives, there's a smaller base to benefit from it. That's sequence of returns risk in one paragraph. The average return over that entire 30-year stretch from 1973 to 2002 was roughly 10.5% annually, a solid number by any measure. The portfolio didn't fail because the average return was bad. It failed because the bad returns came first. Think about what that means in practice. Imagine two buckets of water. Both have the same total amount of water added over 30 years. But in the first bucket, someone drills holes in the bottom for the first 3 years, while you're also scooping water out. By the time the holes are patched, there's far less water than the second bucket, even though the same total amount was added. The scooping is your annual withdrawal. The holes are the early losses. Once that water is gone, it can't compound. That's the mechanism. Now put some concrete numbers to this. Research on portfolio failure shows that a 30% drop in your first year of retirement, combined with a 4% withdrawal rate, can drain a $1 million portfolio by year 17, even if the market fully recovers afterward. The damage from early withdrawals during a downturn can't be undone by later gains. For Ken's $1.5 million, the same math plays out, just slightly stretched by the larger base. And here's a comparison that makes this even clearer. 3 retirees each start with $1 million. Same withdrawal rate, same general strategy. But they retire in different years, 1929, 1966, and 2000. After 30 years, the 1929 retiree still has $767,000. The 1966 retiree runs out of money entirely. The 2000 retiree has $934,000 after 26 years. Same average market performance over long periods. Very different outcomes because of when those bad years hit. I want to stop here because something is important. This is not a test of your financial discipline. It's not about whether you saved enough or were careful enough. The sequence of returns trap exists whether you know about it or not. The market doesn't reward good behavior. It just delivers returns in whatever order it wants. I used to think the 4% rule was basically a gold standard. I even walked my own father through the logic of it years ago. Then I actually ran the historical sequences myself and realized I had missed the most important variable. Not how much the market returns, but when it delivers those returns. The plan I recommended was incomplete. So the natural response is, just skip inflation adjustments in the bad years. Don't take that annual raise in your withdrawal when the portfolio is down. That sounds sensible. But it creates a real problem. You don't know which years will be the bad ones until they're already behind you. So you're left with two bad options. Permanently cut your lifestyle every time the market wobbles, which means giving up spending you may never get back, or ignore the rule when things look fine and watch the plan fail anyway. There has to be a better way to handle this automatically, without requiring perfect foresight. And there is. Here's the rule. It's not complicated, but it requires being specific about the trigger. You set a hard line if your portfolio's real value has dropped more than 15% from where it stood at the start of retirement, not from a recent high, but from your baseline starting value. You freeze your withdrawal amount for that year. No inflation adjustment. You take the same dollar amount you took the year before. When the portfolio recovers back above that 15% loss threshold, you add a catch-up adjustment that covers the inflation you missed during the freeze years. That's it. No discretion. No judgment call in the middle of a scary market. The rule makes the decision for you. Let's see what this does for Ken's 1973 scenario. In 1973, his portfolio drops 14.7%. That's painful, but it's just below the 15% trigger. He takes his normal inflation adjustment that year. Then 1974 hits, another 26.5% drop. Now his portfolio is down more than 40% from where he started. The 15% trigger fires. He freezes his withdrawal. No inflation adjustment in 1974. Inflation that year was running around 11%. So instead of increasing his withdrawal by roughly $7,700 to keep up with prices, he stays flat at $70,500. In 1975, the portfolio is still down. The trigger stays active, another freeze. Inflation in 1975 was around 9%. He passes on that adjustment too. Over those 2 years, his real withdrawals are roughly $6,000 to $8,000 lower per year than they would have been under the original plan. That seems like a modest difference. But when you're drawing from a portfolio that's already down 40%, keeping those extra dollars invested means they're available to compound when the recovery begins. By the mid-1980s, the portfolio has recovered above the 15% threshold. At that point, Ken adds the catch-up. He doesn't permanently lose that purchasing power. He just deferred it. The result? The portfolio survives all 30 years. Let's put a number to what that means in practice. Without the guardrail, Ken's plan runs dry around year 24, when the portfolio hits zero. With the guardrail active, even through those 2 brutal early years, the portfolio reaches year 30 with money still in it. The only difference is 2 years of frozen inflation adjustments, roughly $15,000 in deferred spending total. That $15,000 kept invested through the early 1980s bull market did enough work to buy Ken 6 more years of financial security. I remember sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning with a spreadsheet, trying to figure out if my dad's plan could survive a 1973-style sequence. I kept running the numbers and watching the portfolio fail around year 20 or 21. Then I added this one rule. The freeze in those early bad years was enough to shift the outcome. It felt like finding a lever that was hiding in plain sight. Now compare this to the standard advice, which is basically use your judgment. If things look bad, skip the inflation adjustment. The problem is that most people don't skip it because skipping feels like admitting defeat. Or they skip it once, panic, and then make it permanent, cutting their lifestyle forever, even after the market recovers. The guardrail removes that emotional pressure. It triggers only when the numbers say so. It restores spending when the numbers recover. Research on dynamic withdrawal strategies, specifically the Guyton-Klinger framework, which uses a similar trigger-based approach, shows that this type of rule can extend portfolio survival by 4 to 7 years in adverse market sequences compared to a fixed inflation adjustment approach. That's not a minor improvement. For a 65-year-old, that difference can mean the portfolio survives into your late 80s or early 90s instead of running dry in your mid-80s. The trade-off is real, though. During a bad sequence, you're accepting some lifestyle volatility. Your spending won't keep up with inflation in those freeze years. For most people, a frozen withdrawal isn't a disaster. Your core bills don't all rise by 11% in 1 year. But it's worth being honest about. The guardrail doesn't eliminate pain. It just makes the pain temporary and defined rather than unlimited and unknown. Now, this test was done against the 1970s, an era defined by oil shocks and runaway inflation. What happens when the sequence looks completely different? Not high inflation with a sharp drop, but a long, slow grind like the dot-com crash. Let's stress test the same guardrail against someone who retired in January 2000. Let's run the same guardrail through a completely different kind of crisis. Meet Bob, Ken's twin brother, same age, same $1.5 million, same 4.7% withdrawal plan. Bob retires in January 2000. What he walks into is not an oil shock or runaway inflation. It's the dot-com collapse. The S&P 500 loses nearly 40% peak to trough over the next 3 years. Inflation is mild, 2 to 3%. So this is a different stress, a long, grinding equity loss without the inflation pressure that made 1973 so brutal. Without the guardrail, here's what happens. Bob keeps adjusting his withdrawal for inflation every year. His portfolio is shrinking, but his withdrawals keep rising with prices. By 2003, his annual withdrawal has grown, while his portfolio has been cut nearly in half. His effective withdrawal rate, measured against the portfolio he actually has left, has climbed from 4.7% to about 6.1%. That's a dangerous number. A portfolio under that kind of pressure during a recovery year still struggles to get ahead. With the guardrail in place, the 15% trigger fires in 2001 and again in 2002. Bob freezes his withdrawal both years. He's drawing the same flat dollar amount, no inflation bump, through the worst of the crash. By 2003, when the recovery is beginning, his effective withdrawal rate is down to about 4.3% of his remaining portfolio. He enters the recovery in a much better position. When you track the 2000 retirement cohort through 26 years of data out to 2025 and 2026, the difference becomes real money. A retiree using a fixed 4% withdrawal strategy from 2000 ends up with around $934,000 after 26 years. Not bad. But a retiree using dynamic guardrails, where the rule fires automatically in 2001 and 2002, ends with a significantly higher balance because the portfolio entered the 2009 to 2021 bull market with more capital intact. I've been in a version of this situation myself. In 2008, my portfolio dropped about 30% in a matter of months. I remember the temptation to just sell everything and move to cash, stop the bleeding. What kept me from doing that wasn't willpower. It was having a rule written down in advance, a preset decision that I had committed to before panic set in. That rule saved me from a move I would have regretted badly. The trade-off with the guardrail is worth naming clearly. You're giving up inflation protection in the worst years. The adjustment you skip is typically 2 to 4% of your withdrawal. That's real money, but it's not the base amount you planned around. Your mortgage payment doesn't rise just because inflation ticked up 3%. Your groceries and utilities will, but the core of your spending plan stays intact. The pain is real but bounded. Without the guardrail, the pain is unbounded. So the guardrail works in a 1970s style inflation shock, and it works in a 2000s style equity crash. Those are two very different failure modes, and the same automatic rule handles both. But there's still one objection that comes up every time I talk about this. What about the people who simply can't work any longer? The ones who are told to just work 3 more years, but physically or practically can't. Every time a retirement plan shows a gap, the first piece of advice is the same. Work 3 more years. And mathematically, it works. 3 extra years of contributions. 3 fewer years of withdrawals. Social Security at a higher amount, it adds up. But for roughly 40% of Americans approaching retirement, that advice isn't available. Not because they're unwilling, because they physically can't. Health conditions force them out. A layoff at 62 in an industry that isn't hiring people over 55. A spouse or parent who needs care. These aren't edge cases. They're the reason the standard advice feels insulting to a large portion of the people it's aimed at. If you're in that situation, if 3 more years simply isn't on the table, there are 3 levers that don't require full-time employment. The first is housing. If you own a home in a market where your property has appreciated, downsizing can release $200,000 or more in equity. That equity can extend your portfolio's survival without requiring a single extra day of work. The second is Social Security timing. Delaying your claim from your full retirement age to 70 increases your monthly benefit by 24%. That's 8% per year for 3 years, guaranteed by the SSA. If you're currently planning to claim at 62, the difference compared to waiting until 70 is even larger. That higher monthly benefit reduces the amount you need to draw from your portfolio every year, which directly reduces sequence of returns exposure. The third is part-time income. Not a second career, not a demanding side business. Something like 15 hours a week at $25 an hour generates about $20,000 a year. At 4.7%, that $20,000 is the equivalent of having an extra $425,000 in your portfolio. It's not glamorous work, but the math is real. Those 3 levers, housing equity, delayed Social Security, and a small income stream, can add 5 or more years of survival to a plan that would otherwise run short. They don't require going back to a 40-hour week. They don't require you to have started earlier. And none of this is a sign that you failed. Standard retirement models assume full-time employment right up to a clean retirement date. Most real retirements don't look like that. The plan needs to be built for actual life, not the model. Here's what this comes down to. The 4% rule is not broken. It's incomplete. It was designed for a 30-year retirement in a world where you'd simply adjust spending when needed. But it never gave you a rule for when to adjust and by how much. Sequence of returns risk fills that gap in the worst possible way, silently and only visible after the damage is done. The guardrail I showed you today fixes the missing piece. A 15% drop from your starting value triggers a freeze on inflation adjustments. No judgment call required. No trying to time the market or predict which years will be bad. The rule fires when the numbers say so, and it restores your spending power when the numbers recover. That's it. And if you're in the 40% who can't simply work a few more years, the 3 levers are real. Downsizing your home. Delaying Social Security past your full retirement age. A modest part-time income. None of those require heroics. Together, they can add years of survival to a plan that would otherwise fall short. If this video gave you a new way to think about protecting your retirement, please subscribe. I put out practical stress tests and real number breakdowns every week, designed for Americans who are close to retirement and need tools that work in actual life, not just on a calculator. The goal isn't to spend the next 10 years in fear of sequence risk. It's to build a plan that survives it. You've done the hard part, you save the money. Now give it the rules it needs to last.